The year was 1944, December 24th. In a makeshift prisoner of war camp near Reims, France, 200 German women huddled against the bitter cold that cut through their thin uniforms like razors. The war had taken everything from them, their homes, their families, their certainties. What they didn't expect was that on this Christmas Eve, their captors would give them something back. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness so unexpected that it shattered everything you believed about your enemies? What would you do if, in your darkest hour, compassion came from the most unlikely source? Hauptmann Ingrid Weber pressed her back against the cold wooden wall of Barracks 7, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 28, she had been a communications officer for the Wehrmacht, fluent in 3 languages, trained to intercept Allied transmissions and decode their secrets. Now she was prisoner number 1847 in an American camp that smelled of wet wool, boiled cabbage, and despair. Her uniform, once crisp and bearing the proud insignia of the Reich, hung loose on her diminished frame. The Americans had removed all military decorations, but they couldn't strip away the rigid posture she maintained, the defiant tilt of her chin, or the fire that still burned in her gray eyes. Even here, surrounded by barbed wire and enemy soldiers, Ingrid Weber refused to be broken. "They think they've won," she whispered to herself in German, watching through the small window as American guards patrolled the perimeter. Their boots crunched through the snow with mechanical precision, their rifles slung across their shoulders like extensions of their bodies. "They think we'll grovel and beg for their mercy. But the fatherland doesn't raise daughters who surrender their dignity." The cold was relentless. It seeped through the gaps in the wooden planks, crept under the thin blankets they'd been given, and settled into their bones like a living thing. Ingrid's fingers were perpetually stiff, her lips cracked and bleeding. The sensation of true warmth had become a distant memory, something from a life that felt increasingly like a dream. The hunger was worse than the cold. Their daily rations consisted of watery soup, a piece of bread that could fit in the palm of her hand, and occasionally a small portion of boiled potatoes. The aroma of real food, meat, fresh bread, vegetables, had become a torture of memory. Sometimes, lying on her narrow bunk, Ingrid would close her eyes and try to remember the smell of her mother's kitchen in Munich, the way fresh strudel filled the house with sweetness and warmth. The sounds of the camp created a constant symphony of misery, the low murmur of women speaking in hushed German, sharing fears and fading hopes, the creak of wooden bunks under restless bodies, the distant rumble of American trucks bringing supplies that never seemed to include enough food or warm clothing, the sharp crack of boots on frozen ground as guards made their rounds, and underneath it all, the persistent whistle of wind through the barbed wire, a sound that had become the soundtrack to their captivity. Through the window, Ingrid could see the endless rows of identical barracks stretching across the compound. Gray buildings under a gray sky, surrounded by gray snow stained with mud and ash. The horizon was obscured by low-hanging mist that seemed to swallow hope itself. This was their world now, a colorless existence where each day blended into the next in an endless cycle of cold, hunger, and waiting. But Ingrid Weber had been raised on stories of German resilience, of a people who had endured hardships that would break lesser nations. Her father had fought in the Great War, had spoken of trenches and gas attacks and the unbreakable spirit of the German soldier. Her mother had survived the economic collapse of the Weimar Republic, had taught her daughter that strength came not from comfort, but from the ability to endure suffering without losing one's identity. "Every day is a battle of the spirit," Ingrid had written in her last letter home, before the Americans had cut off all communication with the outside world. "They believe they can break us with their cold treatment and meager rations. But the Reich never surrenders, and neither will its daughters. These Americans, they are just another face of the enemy to be despised." The propaganda that had shaped her worldview remained strong even here. The Americans were not individuals with families and fears and hopes. They were the faceless oppressors who had brought destruction to her homeland. They were the ones who dropped bombs on German cities, who killed German children, who sought to destroy everything she held sacred. The fact that they provided basic shelter and food was not kindness, but the minimum required by their own laws. There was no humanity in it, no compassion. It was simply the mechanical functioning of a military machine. As evening approached on December 24th, Ingrid made her way to the mess hall with the other women. The building was cramped and poorly lit, with long wooden tables and benches that had been hastily constructed from whatever materials the Americans could find. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the ever-present aroma of boiled vegetables that had lost any resemblance to actual nutrition. The women filed in silently, their movements automatic after months of the same routine. Sit down. Wait for the guards to distribute the evening ration. Eat quickly before the food grew cold. Return to the barracks before the evening count. Lights out at 9 o'clock. Another day survived in their gray existence. Ingrid took her usual seat near the back of the hall, close to the wall where she could observe everything while remaining as inconspicuous as possible. Around her, the other women maintained the same careful silence that had become their norm. Speaking too loudly might draw unwanted attention from the guards. Showing too much emotion might be seen as weakness or defiance. They had learned to make themselves small, invisible, unremarkable. The mess hall held approximately 200 women, ranging in age from 18 to 60. Some had been Wehrmacht auxiliaries like Ingrid, trained in communications, logistics, or medical support. Others had been civilian workers in occupied territories, caught up in the chaos of the German retreat. A few were nurses who had been captured while treating wounded soldiers. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared the same hollow-eyed expression, the same careful movements of people who had learned that survival meant not drawing attention to oneself. The guards who supervised their meals were typically young American soldiers, boys really, who looked as uncomfortable with their duties as the prisoners were with their situation. They carried their weapons with the casual familiarity of men who had seen combat, but their eyes often avoided direct contact with the women they were guarding. It was easier, Ingrid supposed, to maintain the necessary psychological distance when you didn't have to acknowledge the humanity of your charges. Tonight felt different, though Ingrid couldn't immediately identify why. There was a tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that she couldn't explain. The guards seemed more alert than usual, whispering among themselves in English too rapid and colloquial for her to follow completely. She caught fragments, something about the colonel and special orders and Christmas Eve, but the context remained unclear. The evening ration was distributed with the same mechanical efficiency as always. A bowl of thin soup that might have contained traces of meat if one was optimistic. A piece of bread that was neither fresh nor completely stale. A small portion of boiled turnips that had been cooked until they resembled gray mush. This was sustenance, not food. It was enough to keep them alive, but not enough to maintain strength or hope. Ingrid was lifting the first spoonful of soup to her lips when the mess hall door opened with unusual force. The conversations that had been taking place in whispered German immediately ceased. Every woman in the room turned toward the entrance, their bodies tensing with the automatic fear response that had become second nature. Colonel James Mitchell entered the hall, flanked by his interpreter and 2 enlisted men. Ingrid had seen the colonel before during inspections and administrative procedures, but his presence in the mess hall during evening meal was unprecedented. He was a man in his early 40s, tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of too many difficult decisions. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing confident, but there was something in his expression tonight that Ingrid couldn't read. The silence in the hall was absolute. 200 women held their breath, waiting for whatever announcement or punishment was about to be delivered. In their experience, unexpected visits from senior officers rarely brought good news. Ingrid's hand tightened around her spoon, her body preparing for whatever new hardship was about to be imposed upon them. Colonel Mitchell surveyed the room slowly, his gaze moving from table to table, taking in the faces of the women who stared back at him with mixtures of fear, defiance, and resignation. When his eyes met Ingrid's briefly, she saw something unexpected, not the cold authority she had anticipated, but something that looked almost like sympathy. The moment passed so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. The colonel nodded to his interpreter, a young sergeant who stepped forward with obvious nervousness. The man cleared his throat and began to speak in careful, formal German. "Attention, ladies. Tonight?" The interpreter paused, glancing back at Colonel Mitchell as if seeking confirmation. The colonel nodded encouragingly. "Tonight there are no duties, no guards, no prisoners. It's Christmas." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Ingrid felt her spoon slip from her fingers and clatter against the table. Around her, she could hear sharp intakes of breath, small gasps of confusion and disbelief. The statement made no sense. There were always duties, cleaning assignments, roll calls, work details. There were always guards, armed men who watched their every movement. There were always prisoners. That's what they were, what they would remain until the war ended or they died. But before anyone could process the full meaning of the announcement, the mess hall doors opened again. This time, instead of more officers, American soldiers entered carrying large metal containers and wooden crates. The aroma that preceded them was unlike anything the women had experienced in months, the rich, complex smell of real food. Ingrid watched in stunned silence as the soldiers began setting up what could only be described as a feast. Large platters of roasted meat appeared on the tables, steam rising from the carved portions. Loaves of fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, were placed alongside bowls of real butter. Vegetables that had been roasted rather than boiled into submission filled serving dishes. And then, impossibly, luxuries that had become mythical. Bars of chocolate, tins of real coffee, even small cakes decorated with white icing. The transformation of the mess hall was surreal. What had been a place of barely adequate sustenance became something approaching abundance. The contrast was so stark that many of the women simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. After months of near-starvation rations, the sight of genuine plenty was almost overwhelming. Statistical reality made the gesture even more extraordinary. The average daily caloric intake for German prisoners of war rarely exceeded 1,200 calories, barely enough for basic survival. The medical reports that Ingrid had glimpsed during her brief work in the camp administration office showed consistent weight loss among all prisoners, with many suffering from malnutrition-related ailments. Tonight's meal represented more calories than most of them had consumed in the previous 3 days combined. But it wasn't just the quantity of food that shocked them. It was the quality. The meat was properly seasoned and cooked, not the flavorless protein they had grown accustomed to. The bread was soft and rich, made with real flour and yeast rather than the sawdust extended substitute they usually received. The vegetables retained their color and texture, prepared with care rather than simply boiled until they surrendered all nutritional value. Ingrid's hands trembled as she reached for a piece of the fresh bread. The texture was so foreign after months of hard, stale rations that she almost didn't recognize it as the same substance. When she bit into it, the flavor exploded across her taste buds with an intensity that brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't just bread. It was a connection to a world where food was meant to nourish not just the body, but the spirit. Around her, similar scenes were playing out at every table. Women who had maintained stoic composure through months of hardship were breaking down at the simple act of tasting real food again. Some wept openly, unable to contain the emotional release that came with this unexpected kindness. Others ate in reverent silence, as if afraid that speaking might break the spell and return them to their gray reality. The chocolate was perhaps the most powerful symbol of all. In wartime, chocolate was a luxury reserved for the victorious, a treat that represented abundance and celebration. For prisoners of war, it was as foreign as gold or precious gems. When Ingrid unwrapped her small piece, the rich aroma transported her instantly to childhood memories of Christmas mornings in Munich, of her mother's smile as she distributed special treats that had been saved for months. The American soldiers who had brought the food stood quietly along the walls, their weapons lowered, their expressions carefully neutral. But Ingrid noticed that some of them were watching the women's reactions with something that looked like satisfaction. These young men who had been trained to see her and her companions as enemies were witnessing the profound impact of their gesture. The rigid categories of friend and foe were blurring in the face of shared humanity. As the initial shock of the food began to subside, Colonel Mitchell made another gesture to his interpreter. The young sergeant stepped forward again, this time carrying a portable gramophone and a collection of records. With careful precision, he wound the machine and placed a record on the turntable. The first notes that emerged were hauntingly familiar, a German Christmas carol that every woman in the room had known since childhood. The effect was immediate and devastating. The melody of O Tannenbaum filled the mess hall, and with it came a flood of memories that had been carefully suppressed for months. Ingrid closed her eyes and was instantly transported to the Christmas Eve services of her youth. Standing beside her parents in the warm glow of candlelight, her voice joining hundreds of others in celebration of hope and renewal. But it wasn't just nostalgia that moved through the room. It was the profound recognition that their captors had chosen to honor their culture, their traditions, their humanity. The Americans could have played their own Christmas music, could have imposed their own cultural celebrations. Instead, they had specifically selected music that would speak to the hearts and memories of their prisoners. As the familiar melody continued, something extraordinary began to happen. One voice, then another, began to sing along, tentatively at first, as if testing whether such expression was permitted, then with growing confidence as no one moved to stop them. Soon dozens of voices were joining the gramophone in a harmony that transformed the cold mess hall into something approaching a sanctuary. Ingrid found her own voice joining the chorus, the German words flowing from her lips with an ease that surprised her. She hadn't sung in months, hadn't allowed herself the vulnerability that music required. But here, surrounded by her fellow prisoners and watched by their captors, she felt safe enough to let her voice carry the emotions she had been holding inside. The singing seemed to break down the last barriers of reserve. Women who had been strangers to each other, united only by their shared captivity, began to reach across the tables to clasp hands. The elderly nurse from Hamburg found herself embracing the young communications operator from Berlin. The civilian worker from occupied Poland shared her chocolate with the Wehrmacht auxiliary from Munich. It was during this moment of musical communion that the final surprise was revealed. American soldiers began distributing paper and pencils, and the interpreter announced that anyone who wished could write a letter home. More than that, these letters would actually be sent, carried through the complex network of Red Cross communications that occasionally succeeded in bridging the vast distances created by war. For most of the women, this was the first opportunity they had been given to communicate with their families since their capture. The uncertainty about the fate of their loved ones had been perhaps the cruelest aspect of their imprisonment. Were their parents still alive? Had their homes survived the bombing? Did anyone even know they were still breathing? Ingrid stared at the blank piece of paper in front of her, her mind racing with everything she wanted to say and everything she couldn't. How could she explain what had happened to her? How could she describe the strange kindness of their captors without seeming to betray her loyalty to the Reich? How could she express her love and longing without revealing the depth of her despair? The pen felt foreign in her hand after months without writing anything more substantial than her prisoner number. Her first attempts at words were shaky, uncertain, but gradually her natural eloquence returned. She began with the basics. She was alive, she was unharmed, she thought of home every day. But as she continued writing, something deeper emerged. "Dearest mother and father," she wrote, "tonight I have experienced something I cannot fully explain. Our captors, whom I have been taught to see as heartless enemies, have shown us a kindness that defies understanding. They have fed us as if we were guests rather than prisoners. They have played our music. They have allowed us to remember who we were before this war consumed everything. I do not know what this means, or how to reconcile it with everything I believed about our enemies. But I wanted you to know that even in this dark place, there are moments when humanity shines through the darkness." Around her, similar scenes were playing out as women struggled to find words for experiences that transcended their previous understanding of the world. Some wrote simple messages of love and reassurance. Others poured out months of accumulated fear and longing. A few, like Ingrid, grappled with the philosophical implications of what they were witnessing. The elderly nurse, whose hands shook with age and malnutrition, wrote to her son serving somewhere on the Eastern Front, "My dear boy, tonight I learned that kindness can exist even between enemies. If you are reading this, remember that the men you fight against are also sons and fathers. Perhaps someday, when this madness ends, we can all remember how to be human again." The young communications operator from Berlin, barely 18 years old, wrote to her sweetheart, "Hans, I don't know if you're still alive, if you're still fighting, if you still love me. But tonight, American soldiers gave me chocolate and played Christmas music, and I remembered what it felt like to hope. If we survive this war, if we find each other again, I want to tell you about the night when enemies became something else. something I don't have words for yet. As the evening progressed, the artificial boundaries that had defined their existence began to dissolve. The rigid hierarchy between guards and prisoners softened into something more complex. American soldiers found themselves in quiet conversations with German women, using gestures and the few words of each other's languages they had picked up. The conversations were simple, about families, about home, about the universal experiences that transcended national boundaries. One young American private, who couldn't have been more than 19, showed a photograph of his girlfriend back in Iowa to a German auxiliary who was roughly the same age. Despite the language barrier, the emotions conveyed by the image were universal. The German woman responded by sketching a quick portrait of her own boyfriend on a scrap of paper, and for a moment, they were just two young people sharing their hopes for the future. Colonel Mitchell moved through the hall quietly, observing the interactions with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He knew that his decision to authorize this evening's activities was controversial, potentially career-ending if the wrong superior officer decided to make an issue of it. The military regulations regarding prisoner treatment were clear about maintaining appropriate distance and authority. Fraternization was strictly forbidden, and providing luxuries beyond basic necessities could be seen as a waste of military resources. But Mitchell had seen too much of war's brutality to believe that adding more cruelty would serve any useful purpose. These women were defeated enemies, not active threats. They were far from home, uncertain about their futures, separated from everyone they loved. Showing them basic human decency on Christmas Eve seemed like the minimum requirement of civilized behavior, regardless of what the regulations might say. The colonel's own background informed his decision in ways that his subordinates couldn't fully understand. Before the war, he had been a teacher in a small town in Ohio, a man who believed in the fundamental dignity of every human being. The military had trained him to kill efficiently and to command effectively, but it hadn't erased his basic conviction that cruelty for its own sake was always wrong. He had also lost his own son in the Pacific Theater 6 months earlier, a loss that had left him questioning many of his assumptions about war and sacrifice. Standing in the mess hall, watching German women weep over Christmas music and chocolate, he couldn't help but think about his son's final letter, in which the boy had written about the Japanese prisoners he had encountered, and his surprise at discovering their humanity. "Dad," his son had written, "they're not the monsters we expected. They're scared kids mostly, far from home and wondering if they'll ever see their families again. I know they're the enemy, but sometimes I look at them and just see somebody's son, somebody's brother. It makes everything more complicated than they told us it would be." Now, watching the interactions between his soldiers and their prisoners, Mitchell understood what his son had meant. War required the dehumanization of the enemy to function effectively, but that dehumanization came at a cost to everyone involved. Tonight, for just a few hours, he was allowing everyone in the room to remember that their enemies were also human beings, with families and fears and hopes. The evening reached its emotional climax when an elderly German woman, a nurse who had been captured while treating wounded soldiers, stood up slowly and began to sing Silent Night in German. Her voice was thin and wavering, but it carried a purity of emotion that silenced every conversation in the room. One by one, other voices joined hers, creating a harmony that seemed to transcend the physical boundaries of the mess hall. What made the moment even more extraordinary was when several of the American guards began to sing along in English, their voices blending with the German lyrics in a musical representation of shared humanity. The same song, the same melody, the same message of peace and hope, expressed in the languages of enemies who had discovered, for one evening, that they were more alike than different. Ingrid found herself crying openly for the first time since her capture. The tears came not from sadness or despair, but from a complex mixture of gratitude, confusion, and recognition. The worldview that had sustained her through months of captivity, the clear division between good and evil, friend and enemy, us and them, was crumbling in the face of this unexpected kindness. How could she maintain her hatred for the Americans when they had fed her better than she had eaten in months? How could she see them as heartless oppressors when they had played her childhood music and allowed her to write to her family? How could she deny their humanity when they had gone out of their way to acknowledge hers? The internal conflict was profound and disorienting. Everything she had been taught about the war, about the enemy, about the righteousness of her cause, was being challenged by the simple act of sharing a meal. The propaganda that had shaped her understanding of the world had not prepared her for the possibility that her captors might be capable of genuine compassion. As the evening drew to a close, Colonel Mitchell stood and addressed the room one final time through his interpreter. "Ladies," the translation came, "tomorrow we return to the realities of war and captivity. But tonight we have shared something that transcends those realities. You are mothers and daughters, sisters and sweethearts. You are human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of the uniforms you once wore, or the flags you once served. Remember this evening, and remember that even in the darkest times, kindness is possible." The cleanup that followed was unlike any other evening in the camp's history. Instead of the hurried, mechanical clearing of tables and dishes, the process became almost ceremonial. Women carefully folded their letters, treasuring them like precious artifacts. The remaining chocolate was divided and shared, with many saving pieces to savor later in the privacy of their bunks. The gramophone continued to play softly as the tables were cleared, the music providing a soundtrack to the end of an extraordinary evening. As the women filed out of the mess hall, many paused to nod their thanks to the American soldiers who had made the evening possible. The gestures were small and subtle, a brief eye contact, a slight bow of the head, a whispered "danke" that transcended language barriers. The soldiers responded with their own small acknowledgments, brief smiles or nods that conveyed their understanding of what had transpired. Ingrid was among the last to leave, reluctant to return to the cold reality of the barracks. She clutched her letter in one hand and a small piece of chocolate in the other, tangible proof that the evening had actually happened. As she passed Colonel Mitchell, who was standing near the door, she stopped and looked directly into his eyes. "Warum?" she asked quietly. "Why?" Mitchell didn't speak German, but he understood the question. He was quiet for a moment, considering his response. Finally, he said simply, "Because it's Christmas. Because you're human beings. Because kindness matters even in war." The interpreter translated, and Ingrid nodded slowly. She wanted to say more, to express the complexity of her emotions, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply said, "Danke," and walked out into the cold night air. The return to the barracks was subdued but not silent. Women walked in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about what they had experienced. Some were still crying, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the evening. Others seemed lost in thought, processing the implications of what had happened. A few hummed Christmas carols under their breath, reluctant to let the music end. In Barracks 7, Ingrid lay on her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling and listening to the quiet conversations around her. The woman in the next bunk, a communications specialist from Hamburg, whispered, "I don't understand what happened tonight. Are they trying to break us with kindness? Is this some kind of psychological warfare?" Another voice responded from across the room, "I don't care what their motives were. For 3 hours I felt human again. I tasted real food. I heard our music. I wrote to my children. Whatever happens tomorrow, they can't take that away from us." An older woman, a nurse who had seen the worst of the war's casualties, offered a different perspective. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we have been wrong about some things. Perhaps the world is more complicated than we were taught to believe. Perhaps our enemies are not so different from us." The conversation continued in whispers until exhaustion finally claimed them. But even in sleep, the evening's events continued to resonate. Dreams were filled with the taste of chocolate, the sound of familiar music, and the strange experience of being treated with dignity by those they had been taught to hate. December 25th dawned cold and gray, much like every other day in the camp. The morning roll call proceeded as usual, with guards counting prisoners and checking for any overnight incidents. The breakfast ration was the same watery porridge and stale bread that had become routine. The work assignments were distributed with the same mechanical efficiency that characterized all camp operations. But despite the return to normal procedures, something fundamental had changed. The guards seemed slightly less rigid in their interactions with the prisoners. The women carried themselves with a subtle difference, a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. The harsh realities of captivity remained, but they were now tempered by the memory of unexpected kindness. Ingrid found herself assigned to kitchen duty. a rotation that normally filled her with dread due to the constant reminder of their inadequate food supplies. But today, as she scrubbed pots and cleaned surfaces, she found herself thinking about the previous evening's feast. The contrast was stark, but instead of making her current situation seem worse, the memory of abundance somehow made the present more bearable. During the lunch break, she overheard two American soldiers discussing the previous evening. Their conversation was in English, but her language training allowed her to follow most of it. "The colonel's getting heat from headquarters about last night," one soldier said. "Apparently someone filed a report about inappropriate use of military resources and unauthorized fraternization with enemy prisoners." "That's bullshit," the other soldier replied. "Those women aren't a threat to anyone. They're just scared people far from home. What's wrong with showing a little human decency?" "I'm not arguing with you," the first soldier said. "I'm just telling you what I heard. The colonel might be facing a formal reprimand." The conversation troubled Ingrid more than she expected. The idea that Colonel Mitchell might be punished for his act of kindness seemed fundamentally wrong, regardless of military regulations or national loyalties. The man had risked his career to treat her and her fellow prisoners as human beings, and the thought that he might suffer consequences for that decision filled her with an unfamiliar emotion, concern for the welfare of her captor. That afternoon, during the designated letter-writing period that had been established as a regular privilege following the previous evening's success, Ingrid found herself composing a different kind of message. Instead of writing to her family, she carefully crafted a letter to the International Red Cross, documenting the treatment she and her fellow prisoners had received and specifically praising Colonel Mitchell's leadership and humanity. She knew that such a letter might never reach its destination, and that even if it did, it might have no impact on military bureaucracy, but she felt compelled to try, to use what little influence she might have to protect the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. It was a small gesture, but it represented a fundamental shift in her thinking, from seeing her captors as faceless enemies to recognizing them as individuals capable of both good and evil. The days that followed Christmas established a new rhythm in the camp. The extraordinary feast was not repeated, but small changes in routine reflected the evening's impact. The guards were more likely to engage in brief, polite interactions with prisoners. The evening meal, while still basic, was prepared with slightly more care. The gramophone made occasional appearances, playing music that helped maintain morale during the long winter nights. More significantly, the letter-writing privilege became a regular feature of camp life. Once a week, prisoners were allowed to write brief messages to their families, with the understanding that delivery could not be guaranteed, but that efforts would be made to route the letters through Red Cross channels. For many women, this connection to the outside world became a lifeline that made their captivity bearable. The psychological impact of the Christmas Eve dinner extended far beyond the immediate participants. Word of the event spread through the network of prisoner-of-war camps, carried by transferred guards and relocated prisoners. The story grew in the telling, becoming a legend that offered hope to other captives and challenged assumptions about the nature of their captors. Some versions of the story emphasized the abundance of the food, describing a feast that rivaled pre-war celebrations. Others focused on the music and the emotional release it provided. Still others highlighted the letter-writing opportunity and the precious connection it offered to distant families. But all versions shared the central theme, that even in the midst of war, humanity could triumph over hatred. For the American soldiers who had participated in the evening, the experience was equally transformative. Many had entered military service with clear ideas about good and evil, friend and enemy, us and them. The sight of German women weeping over Christmas music and chocolate had complicated those simple categories, forcing them to confront the humanity of those they had been trained to see as adversaries. Private Tommy Rodriguez from Texas found himself thinking about his own mother's tears when he had left for the war. The German woman who had cried while writing her letter could have been his mother, separated from her son by circumstances beyond her control. The recognition of that shared experience had changed something fundamental in his understanding of the conflict. Sergeant Bill O'Connor from Boston, whose brother had been killed in the Battle of the Bulge just weeks earlier, struggled with conflicting emotions. His hatred for the German military remained strong, But he found it increasingly difficult to extend that hatred to the women in the camp. They were not the ones who had killed his brother, not the ones who had started the war. They were casualties of the same conflict that had claimed so many on both sides. The ripple effects of that Christmas Eve dinner continued to spread throughout the war and beyond. Several of the American soldiers who participated would later write about the experience in letters home, in post-war memoirs, and in interviews with historians. Their accounts helped preserve the story and contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of human behavior during wartime. For the German women, the memory of that evening became a source of strength during the remaining months of their captivity. When food was scarce, they remembered the taste of real bread and chocolate. When despair threatened to overwhelm them, they recalled the sound of their own voices singing Christmas carols. When hatred for their captors grew strong, they thought of Colonel Mitchell's quiet dignity and unexpected kindness. The war ended in May 1945, and the process of repatriation began slowly. Many of the women faced uncertain futures, homes destroyed by bombing, families scattered or killed, a homeland divided and occupied by foreign powers. But they carried with them the memory of a Christmas Eve when enemies had chosen compassion over cruelty, when the artificial divisions of war had been temporarily set aside in favor of shared humanity. Ingrid Weber was among the last to be repatriated, her language skills making her valuable for administrative tasks during the camp's closure. In the final weeks of her captivity, she had several opportunities to speak with Colonel Mitchell, conversations that helped her process the complex emotions surrounding her experience. "I want you to know," she told him during one of their last meetings, "that what you did that night changed something in me. I had been taught to hate you, to see you as the enemy of everything I held dear. But your kindness forced me to question those teachings, to recognize that the world is more complicated than I had been led to believe." Mitchell, who had indeed received a formal reprimand for his actions, but had avoided more serious consequences thanks to testimonials from prisoners and subordinates alike, smiled sadly. "War makes enemies of people who might otherwise be friends," he said. "I'm glad we could find a way to remember our shared humanity, even briefly." "Will you write to me?" Ingrid asked. "After the war, when we're both home, will you let me know that you're well?" "I don't think that would be appropriate," Mitchell replied gently. "We come from different worlds, and those worlds are still very much at odds. But I'll remember you, and I'll remember that evening, and I'll try to carry the lesson forward into whatever comes next." The final goodbye was brief and formal, but both understood the significance of what they had shared. They had been enemies who had discovered their common humanity, adversaries who had found a moment of peace in the midst of war. It was a small victory against the forces of hatred and division, but it was a victory nonetheless. Decades later, in a small garden behind her home in Munich, an elderly Ingrid Weber sat with her grandson, sharing stories of the war years. The boy, born into a world of peace and prosperity, struggled to understand the conflicts that had shaped his grandmother's generation. "Oma," he asked, "how could people who were enemies become friends, even for one night?" Ingrid smiled, her weathered hands folding carefully in her lap. "Because, mein Lieber, underneath all the uniforms and flags and propaganda, we are all human beings. We all feel cold and hunger and loneliness. We all miss our families when we're far from home. We all need kindness, especially when the world seems determined to offer only cruelty." "But they were your enemies," the boy persisted. "They had captured you, imprisoned you. Why would they be kind?" "That," Ingrid said softly, "is the mystery and the miracle of human nature. Sometimes when we least expect it, people choose compassion over hatred, understanding over ignorance, love over fear." That Christmas Eve in 1944, a group of American soldiers and their commander chose to see us not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. It was a gift more precious than any food or music. It was the gift of recognition, of dignity, of hope. The old woman's eyes grew distant as she remembered that long-ago evening. "In the darkest winter of our lives, the enemy gave us back our humanity, even if only for one night. It changed everything, not just for us, but for them as well. It reminded us all that even in the midst of war's madness, kindness is possible, forgiveness is possible, peace is possible. As the sun set over the peaceful German countryside, Ingrid Weber closed her eyes and could still hear the faint echo of Christmas carols sung in 2 languages, still taste the sweetness of unexpected chocolate, still feel the warmth of human compassion that had transcended the artificial boundaries of war. It had been more than 70 years since that Christmas Eve, but the memory remained as vivid and powerful as ever, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the possibility of finding light even in the darkest of times. The story of that Christmas Eve dinner became part of the historical record, documented in military archives and personal memoirs, studied by historians and sociologists interested in the complexities of human behavior during wartime. But beyond its academic significance, it remained a powerful reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of kindness can illuminate the path toward understanding and reconciliation. What unexpected act of kindness have you witnessed that transformed a situation of conflict? How do you think such moments of shared humanity can help us bridge the divisions that separate us today? If stories like this one, which challenge everything we think we know about enemies and friends, resonate with you, consider how we might apply these lessons to the conflicts and divisions of our own time.